So for the past few weeks, I've been learning how to run the One Ring role-playing game. The One Ring is a role-playing game from 2011, and from what I've read online, it's basically the best fantasy role-playing game ever made that's based on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I'm not going to summarize all those works because I'm going to assume you have some level of familiarity with them, even if just from Peter Jackson's films. But I think it's important just to understand timeline-wise where the One Ring fits, because it's a really unique campaign setting. So the world of The Hobbit, that book ends in Middle-earth time in the year 2941. That's when the Battle of Five Armies takes place. That's when Bilbo retires to the Shire with the One Ring and whatever treasure. One Ring picks up in 2946, roughly 5 years after the Battle of Five Armies. And then there's a 60-year time span before the Lord of the Rings kicks off with the Fellowship, with Frodo taking the ring and going on his journey. We're all familiar with at this point. Maybe. Maybe we are. The One Ring takes place during this unique 60-year period of time after the Battle of Five Armies, when a bunch of goblins have been destroyed, so it's a more peaceful time and a hopeful time. The most important thing about that chunk of time, that 60-year period, is that Tolkien didn't write a lot about what takes place during that time, so it's an opportunity for role players and storytellers to introduce new and interesting tales and characters. I want to first, before I go into that, talk about the overall intimidation I feel about touching this material, because I am very intimidated by this game. I have been intimidated by this game for a few months. As someone who's played video games for however many years, I get so excited when games have good lore in them, you know, when they have interesting stories and backgrounds. And to play a game like The One Ring, which has good lore, let's say it's good lore because it's based on some of the most famous fantasy novels ever written, is super intimidating, because it presumes that I am going to become incredibly familiar with them in order to run the game, right? I would have to. Tolkien is a unique author. I mean, he created his own world with his own languages, his own creatures, and some very cool maps. So running a game in that world feels just a little bit wrong. Like, if he didn't write it, maybe it wasn't supposed to happen. But still, it's fun to explore, and we are definitely entering the realm of fan fiction and unique storytelling. Let's just call it unique storytelling. As an expression of my intimidation, I actually purchased all of the books. I purchased all of the books. I got these nice editions, including The Hobbit, and I read them all before I even got into the core book for the game. I was inspired by the idea of running the game, and I assumed all that learning would come up and be useful in some way. And it was a blast. Super fun books to read, especially if you have the idea that you're going to run a game based in that world and in that setting. Tick it in the back of your mind the whole time. Makes it super fun. Working with an established setting is both amazing and terrible. I mean, it's amazing because all of the players that you'll get to join you will probably have some familiarity with where they're at. They'll have seen the Peter Jackson films or read a book, and they'll have a sense of where they are, which I've never had happen playing Dungeons & Dragons. Even though they do write campaign-setting stories and novels, not every player is going to come with that knowledge into the game. But with Tolkien, there's a sense of the realness of the world just from the beginning. But the rough side of running a game in an established setting like this is it assumes that the lore master, which is the term they use in The One Ring, has just a lot of knowledge of the setting. I actually don't think it's true. I think you can get by knowing a lot less. Like any game, you can get by knowing a ton less. I think you'll have more fun if you're familiar with the material, because you can really enjoy some of the references, the characters, and the settings. So it's definitely behooves you to be immersed in the material, but you don't have to be. What I'm discovering after having read the core campaign book and run a session of the game so far is that it's incredibly immersive. And a super essential point that has been made elsewhere about The One Ring is that it's based on the books and not the films. And I think that's an essential distinction to make, because the films are very action-oriented. All the video games that are based on the films are action-oriented. It's a lot of hack and slash. Now, there is combat in The One Ring, but there's also a lot of exploration and some unique exploration mechanics that I haven't seen in Dungeons & Dragons or other games. Another intimidating factor about the game is that it's set in Middle-earth, and Middle-earth feels massive. It is pretty big, but the core book only really deals with the area of Wilderland, which is the area from the Misty Mountains to Running River, with Mirkwood in between as the main source of the campaign adventures. You also have the Lonely Mountain, Esgaroth, which is aka Lake Town, and Dale, which is a city that didn't really exist in The Hobbit because it was destroyed, but it's rebuilt. You get an Elvish kingdom in the north. There's the area of Wilderland in the south where the woodmen live, and there's Bjorn, who's the rad, weird, shape-shifting character that's in the western part of Wilderland. So the initial campaign for the game, the Marsh Bell, which is the pre-written campaign, highly recommended by the way, all the pre-written campaigns that I've looked at so far have been beautifully written. The Marsh Bell campaign just takes place within this little world. There's a Mirkwood campaign book, which I haven't gone into, which takes place in the same area from what I understand. So there's a lot of world building that takes place just in this little patch without having all your characters need to explore into Mordor or Rohan and other areas within Middle-earth. You don't have to have encyclopedic knowledge or have bought all the campaign guides. You're really focused on a tiny patch of Middle-earth. And I love that because it makes something that's so intimidating so much more manageable. So what makes this game super unique and fun are the mechanics that induce a certain style of play and certain style of storytelling. And I haven't seen a lot of role-playing games, so I don't have a sense of what other games are using mechanics like this, but based on my experience with Dungeons & Dragons, which is very combat-oriented, I was excited to see these other mechanics that explore literally exploration, journeying, resting phases, like where you might learn new skills or just tell different stories, as well as these encounters or introductions to important characters. There's also this concept of shadow and hope points, which is an interesting way to look at a way a character is corrupted by negative influences. I think that's a really cool idea and it's really well implemented. There's also a concept of treasure points, and I think it's a beautiful system. Coming from the world of Dungeons & Dragons where you're having heroes constantly, and I shouldn't even use the word heroes, characters. We'll call them characters because in Dungeons & Dragons, there's alignments. So not everybody has to be heroic. They can be totally evil characters. So in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, there's a lot of looting happening all the time. Well, in the world of the One Ring, there's a lot less, in part because there are treasure points. So yes, you can get unique treasure, but it's worth treasure points. So it's like a score goes up versus getting unique specific treasure that is a magical item and can do a thing. And while there are magical items in the world of the One Ring, there are a lot fewer of them, and you get them for cultural rewards for being a good character and playing that character well, right? Versus just like stealing them or buying them. I think it's an interesting way to award more heroic play. So the shadow and hope point system is interesting. Each character starts with a finite number of hope points, and you use those points in order to increase your rolls. So just like many role-playing games, you are rolling dice. That's whenever there's a skill move of some kind. And so you'll use a hope point in order to add one of your three main stats, body, heart, or wit, to your overall roll, and hopefully you succeed. Otherwise you wouldn't have spent the point. And then on the other side, there's these shadow points. So if you fail a corruption check, whether you're in a blighted area, someplace that's super creepy, or near corrupted treasure, then you roll a corruption check, and if you fail, then you get a shadow point. And if the shadow points move up over the hope points, then your character suffers their shadow weakness, and something crazy will happen. Then the lore master takes over the character and has them do something terrible as described by their shadow weakness. Then the character gets a permanent shadow point. I think it's really neat because it gives you a unique lens or like a window into understanding how a character will become corrupted and do some of the terrible things they might do in a Tolkien universe. For example, in Lord of the Rings, I believe it's at the end of Fellowship where Boromir, one of the men, tries to get the ring from Frodo, and it's like a sad moment, right? Because Boromir is corrupted by the potential power and what he thinks he could do with it. And he wants to basically take it from Frodo when Frodo doesn't want to give it to him. And you could see a moment like that playing out in the world of the One Ring, given this shadow hope system and the way it's scripted. Another cool mechanic in the world of the One Ring is the encounters mechanics. So anytime the players or the heroes meet up with an important character, or maybe a character they don't know yet, like maybe one of the dwarves that were on the initial campaign with Bilbo to get Smaug's treasure. Well, then that becomes its own miniature game within the game. So based on certain stats that your characters might have, maybe even their race, the character that they're being introduced to will have a tolerance number. And the tolerance number could be like 1 or 2. And that's how many times you can fail a roll before you fail out of the encounter. So it encourages you to be decisive and to make your rolls matter. And to do role-playing that would positively influence your character's performance and get a better overall outcome. And I think that's cool. In D&D, you get these various charisma rolls that you just see characters use again and again, and they are not as nuanced, in part because those things work in Dungeons & Dragons, but there isn't a system that provides enough of a consequence if things go wrong. Of course, that's up to me as the dungeon master, of course, but in the One Ring, it's set up with higher stakes without having the lore master to create those stakes. It's written into the design of the game, and I think that's very cool. Then a couple other interesting systems are journeying and combat. So when you're journeying, when characters are moving from one place to another, you assign roles to each character. So someone could be a guide or a scout. And so then there are certain roles associated with those characters, and based on those roles, certain moves take place. Now, you can add journeying into a system like Dungeons & Dragons, but it's not something the game feels specifically built for. It really wants you to get into combat and search for traps and be in dungeons, and not necessarily the wilderness survival of exploration. I think this game takes more pleasure in that style of movement, and it's fun because it adds to the role-playing in those environments, allows characters to create more stories based on their characters and how they might journey from one place to another. Because these books, Tolkien's books, are full of long journeys. I was watching another YouTuber, and he was literally suggesting if you are like coming up with stories for this game or thinking about how you might run this game, go for a hike.
Get outdoors as much as you can and just think about the world that you're seeing around you.
Those are awesome suggestions. I don't feel like anywhere in D&D, in any of the Dungeon Master's guides, to suggest going for a hike. Of course you could. Another interesting thing about the game is the combat systems, which are less focused on miniature combat. So it's not in specific combat. Characters take a stance forward to rear. And so it's more theater of the mind style combat, which I think is interesting. So it really wants you to imagine yourself as these characters and in the unique stakes that you're in, but not with specific maps and detailed movements. So that's a unique choice. These are some great combat maps I found online, as well as some journeying stuff. I'll put these in the notes, but these are great for orienting yourself around some of these sessions and helping players understand how combat will be handled. And one more final phase. I know I'm going to talk about every phase of this game, but one more final phase that's cool is the fellowship phase. And this I haven't gotten to yet in my campaign, but I'm excited to. That's at the end of the adventure. There's a period of rest where characters can improve their stats and relax, and then also tell stories about what they did, which I think is cool, since it invites characters to narratively reflect on why they made their choices and what they did. I haven't read the Silmarillion. I have started it while working on this game, and I think it's a lot of fun, but I don't think it's required. I would definitely read The Hobbit. The Lord of the Rings is helpful, but you don't have to read all of Tolkien's works. The thing is, you will want to because it's such an immersive experience. I bought the Lore Master screen, which contains amazing cheat sheets for how to run every type of encounter in the game, combat, etc. I think they're helpful, though it's not necessary to have access to all this information. This stuff's all in the book. The tables that the Lore Master screen has are pretty amazing, so if there was a way for you to copy this information or have it available to you, I think it would be totally worth it. So there's some amazing character generators online. So D&D Beyond has them, where you can just generate a character. One Ring has some as well, though I don't believe they're official character generators. And I am against using them, not because they aren't helpful, they are, but they're sometimes pulling information about character classes that aren't in the core book. And as someone who is running the game from just the core book, I don't have all these other campaign guides. So when questions came up, because in the game I ran, some characters chose some of the classes or the types of characters that were not in the core book, I wasn't aware of it, and it wasn't able to address a lot of those issues, and so I had to have them reselect characters to reflect the stuff that's in the core book. And that's just something that's going to happen if you have new players who maybe haven't gone through the book with you. Another issue I have with these online character generators is that people will go through them so quickly that they don't have a sense of what the numbers mean or where they're even from. And so when they level up or there's some question about the rules, like ultimately they don't know what it means to have 2 diamonds in fishing. What does that mean, right? Having some time to explain at the table what each of those stats mean and what choices are being made, I think is important. A character generator would be great for your second or third characters, but for your first character, definitely at the table. I've been running role-playing games for a few months, and the One Ring is the first game I just want to read. Like, I'd be so happy to get the rest of the campaign books and just read them, because the stories are interesting and well written and expand the universe. And while these stories may not be canonical, they do feel grounded and real. And as someone who is just now getting into Tolkien, like, this is the immersive stuff I'm looking for, and it's awesome. It's not quite like the experience I had trying to get into Star Wars. Star Wars books, as a total aside, can be so much fun to read, and they expand the Star Wars universe. And, you know, it kind of sucked when Disney bought Star Wars because they just like killed off all these previous works by saying they were non-canonical. If you don't know what I mean, I'm sorry, but like there hasn't been some Tolkien god that stepped in and said that these books don't matter. And I assume if that happened, I would feel a little weird about it. And maybe someone has, and I just haven't read about it. But at this point, to me, they feel like they could take place in that universe. I appreciate that, and I'm enjoying them as if they really happened. So thanks for watching. This is me explaining my experience running the One Ring. It's been a lot of fun. I've run the game just one time so far, spent weeks preparing for that one session, but I'm excited to run the next one and to explore more of the world of Middle-earth. If you are planning on running your own campaign in the One Ring, I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear what quests are good and what campaigns are worth pursuing. I'm looking into the Mirkwood campaign to go into after this one, but if there are better ones, I'd love to hear about it. And if there are ones that you've enjoyed just reading, I'd love to hear about that too. I make videos about things I'm into every week. And this one took a few weeks for me, in part because I was so intimidated by the source material, and here we are, and I did it anyway. So I apologize if I've mispronounced any names or if I said anything inaccurate about the Tolkien universe. That wasn't my intention. I just want to have a great time and enjoy some Middle-earth role-playing. Any event, thanks so much. Talk to you later.